Information, as you know, is a multi-faced and debated notion. What we can say about the theories that try to define information is that they are divided roughly into two large categories. One category view information as a part of human communication, so as a way to process raw data and achieve eventually knowledge and eventually wisdom. It's the DIQW pyramid, data, information, and knowledge, wisdom. These theories are based mostly on classic Claude Shannon's theory of mathematical theory of communication. So every data, every piece of information is a way towards knowledge and a way of uncertainty, what he calls entropy. So information is a human-made thing that tries to achieve knowledge. And we have a second group of theories that are more modern, that view information as a natural phenomenon, so they dehumanize information, let's say. They're based on the fact that information is linked to the DNA. So we have decodified the DNA, and we have seen that information is not only a thing, it's not a human privilege, is a thing that is always present in every part of nature. For this presentation, I will have the stance mostly to the most classical theories of communication and knowledge. And I will try to link this with the subject of power inequalities. So my argument is that information is a human-made notion that is not equally accessible because of pre-existing power inequalities. For example, the state-citizen power inequality or the employer-employee power inequality, but even less obvious societal relationships, just like the family and the school. My argument is that the informational gaps that exist in these relationships actually reproduce the power inequalities within these relationships. And the role of the law is to bridge these gaps according to generally accepted democratic values against inequalities. In a democracy, it's supposed to be that the law bridges inequalities, so tries to regulate it when it's impossible to diminish it, to extinguish it. And I will be based on this general thought. So let's be more specific. I will put the notion of information in the workplace. So what kind of information is controlled by the management that is very regularly not accessible to the workers? It could be personal information like personal data or HR analytics. This part is the mostly debated and discussed nowadays because of the GDPR regulation in Europe. But we could say that it's more sensitive. But it's not the only category of information controlled by the management in a workplace, in a given workplace. We can speak about the governance information like the policies on diversity, the wage policies. We could speak about financial information, so the income, the profit of a company. We can speak about and mostly strategic informations like future plans, so how management is going to move in the future and how it will affect workers. So all these information are usually held away from the worker side. So even if workers are participating in generating this information, usually they are themselves the objects of this information. However, they don't control it, and most usually they're not even don't even have access to it. So let's be even more specific, and let's try to transfer this conversation into informational gaps at multinational enterprises. I suggest that these gaps in the case of multinational enterprises are even greater because we have a higher volume of data collected. We have now enterprises that collect like thousands of terabytes of data and stored like wherever in the world. We have, of course, larger distance from the management. So if you are a worker in a multinational enterprise, of course, you can't control what's happening in the central management as you can maybe possibly in a small or medium enterprise. And what I would like to underline is that these informational gaps are more threatening for what is generally accepted as democracy, because we have a construction of an undemocratic governance paradigm. All these multinational enterprises are very important for international economy, and they function under undemocratic internal processes, especially regarding information, so they keep information away from workers. So what we can see is that they promote this paradigm even outside their structures. And I think that it is threatening for democracy, like or as we generally understand it. What the law can do about it? So this is a big question. We have many legislative frameworks regarding the state-citizenship relationship, but we don't have the same volume of frameworks in the societal relationship between the management and the workers. Although we can see that there are 3 existing legal frameworks, and when I say frameworks, I don't specify laws, specific legislative instruments. In each one of these frameworks, there are a lot of instruments, either national or international level. When we can see the multinational enterprise as an employer, we can speak about the workers' right to information, consultation, and co-determination. These are 3 different things. Of course, each one is more progressive than the other. Information is just the right to know what's happening in the enterprise. Consultation, the right to consult, is the right to express your views about the policy of the multinational enterprise. So not just learn what's happening, but also have the right to speak up. And the co-determination, which is the most progressive right, is the right of Mitbestimmung, as it was recognized in Germany, the right to have some maybe positions in the board of directors. Is the most progressive of all these 3. But nowadays, legally recognized is the right to information in European level. The other 2 parts are not so widely recognized, and some laws that had recognized the right to co-determination now have been abolished in Europe. So inside this framework, we can identify the European Works Council's directive. So the construction of specific informational fora, just like the Works Councils, that have this role exactly to get information from the management. The other 2 frameworks mostly view multinational enterprise as societal actors, so not exactly as employer. However, this does affect, of course, workers, just like the first framework. Firstly, we have the extension of freedom of information laws to multinational enterprises. What does it mean? Well, according to general public law, every citizen has the right to apply to any public authority to get information that concerns him or her. This right is constitutionally recognized in many countries, but can be used maybe against multinational enterprises. Well, in some countries, it's legally recognized to be used against multinational enterprises when only they perform public duties. But we have also a very interesting experiment in South Africa when, this in freedom of information law is widely extended to any kind of information, so not only about public procurement and public duties, which is particularly interesting. And moving on, we can see a third framework of existing legal instruments is the corporate social responsibility legislation. This is particularly interesting because it was not exactly in the beginning. It was not a legislative instrument. It was a corporate policy, and then it became a legal instrument. Legal scholars call it a legal transplant. So it was a corporate policy, and it's very interesting because the other 2 frameworks were threatening for multinational enterprise, they tried to block it, to block those two frameworks, the workers' rights to information and the freedom of information laws. That it's not the case in the corporate social responsibility legislation, because they were behind it actually, and they tried to impose it in European level. And we have now the European Directive on the disclosure of non-financial information that enables that, to be more specific, that puts the obligations to multinational enterprises to publish reports regarding financial and non-financial information, and make it clear to maybe other actors inside the company or stakeholders what's happening in the case of human rights, environmental policies, or labor rights within this enterprise. My presentation could have finished now if it was a traditionally, let's say, legal presentation, because it was only a de lege lata, how we call it in Latin, presentation, what's happening now in law. But I would like to make a step forward and try to evaluate this legislation frameworks. In the legal theory, when you evaluate a legislation, is the first question you are faced to is who are you, that you are able to evaluate legislation, because you are not a judge, you are not an expert, in evaluating laws, and you are not an institutional actor. In legal theory, during the last period, we have some scholars that say that you don't need to be somebody to evaluate legislation. It's called legisprudence theory. You have the right to evaluate a law, so it's against the traditional positivist view that there is a law, so it's already there, we can't do anything about it. And the second question is, under which criteria are you going to evaluate the law? Well, in my case now, I'll try to evaluate this in this legislation enabling access to multinational enterprise information from a democratization point of view. This is quite broad. I will propose 3 criteria for it. Of course, it's an open question. It's actually the subject of my PhD project, so it's I'm still working on it. 3 criteria that I could propose right now is if these laws have enhanced the self-governance of workers, so the right of each individual worker to govern his or her life, if they have introduced clear and transparent procedures, so the quality of information that are transmitted, the quality of the procedure, for example, the language or the experts that are used to explain to workers what's happening, or even a third party that could check this procedure. These are open questions in European Works Council, for example. And a third criterion that I propose is how this has involved workers into decision-making processes. So if workers have at least a piece of decision-making in these multinational enterprises. After applying these criteria, it's not clear because I don't have a very broad picture about it, but the existing legislation falls short in many of in those 3 criteria. But still, I believe that the labor movement can utilize these frameworks to enable workers to learn more about what's happening in their multinational enterprise, but not only the workers inside the enterprise, but also people, citizens, and workers in other enterprises, because these actors are very important nowadays, and they are a way, in a way, they govern the financial environment nowadays. And by saying that, I would like to thank you for your attention. Thank you very much.